Madam Chair, is it possible to get a copy of that or get it printed out?
Madam Chair, I did just give copies to Tam, but there's been
Right.
a minor
So
change on one point.
Okay, so rather, of the recommendations?
Yeah.
Yep, so we just thought the bits in red are the only changes. So you've got the recommendations in front of you. Oh, they can be circulated. But just for ease of reading, those are the changes there that you see on the screen. So let's take questions on councillors. So we'll take questions on the presentation by Mr Boven, and then we'll move to the recommendations. Councillor Cashmore.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Rick, for this work, and it must have been trying at times, I could perfectly understand, giving divergent opinions around this issue.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that we have sort of 13 odd ports in New Zealand, what do you see as the relevant importance of a nationwide port protocol that delivers greater efficiencies of the existing structures that we have now?
We didn't. The issue of a nationwide, a national port strategy was not part of our conversation. We did consider, especially once we had all the evidence, possible solutions that went beyond a relocation of the Auckland port, and in that context, consider the prospects for a large-scale port serving northern regions. I think the position probably was that it would be valuable in considering the locations to consider wider options, and we mentioned the idea of a super port, and that would, I think, imply consideration at least of the northern part of New Zealand's port strategy, but it doesn't imply a national port strategy.
Okay. Madam Chair, I have a second question, if I may, Rick, and that's to do with the container TEUs and technology. Auckland's predominance of a car arrival, machinery arrival port, the numbers that are coming through there. So as we move through with greater technologies that have been identified with self-drive cars, machinery, trucks, etc., and with the containers and the TEU numbers out of the trigger points that you've potentially identified, how do you see technology potentially training those, and what margin of error does that potentially build into the discussions that are in the position in the consultant's report?
I think there's various estimates in the consultant's report, and they vary widely. I think port projection people will say, oh, you can project 30 or 40 years, but our scope was 50 years. My view is that there's sufficient uncertainty in the estimates that you would not want to be too sure getting out of that 30 or 40 year period there's quite a range of possibilities even within the estimates. And then beyond the estimates are the more fundamental questions such as those that you're raising, which I mean really confirm that we are in a situation of trying to manage in a state of uncertainty. And that uncertainty will resolve itself with time, which is the reason why we're looking at stepping forward through regular periodic review to look forward and understand, give ourselves enough time, make sure we've got an option.
Thanks, Madam Chair.
Could you just confirm for me the nature of the terms of reference for the group and expectations to speak as one voice? I mean, it seems to me that some of the dissent and the chair outlined some of the correspondence that we've had subsequent to the delivery of your report. In your opinion, is some of that dissent that is now public, is it breaching in any way some of the terms of reference, or what the members of both the reference group and the consensus working group signed on for?
So there's two kinds of contention, I guess. One would be communications from CWG members and others, and having seen those communications, my view is that those do not stray from the consensus that was reached by the group. They are attempts to clarify
Yeah.
and counter positions that are being taken by some and in the press that put a slant or a spin on it that isn't consistent. So I see those as clarification perspectives. There are other views that are being expressed by parties who are outside the consensus working group and who are unhappy with the conclusion, and generally, don't offer a full analysis, but a partial analysis based on their interests. The consensus working group's protocols really were that we would, keep things reasonably close to ourselves, and I was to be the media person, but that was really only up until the point at which we kind of went public with the conclusions. And this is subsequent. I don't think you can hold people to, not represent the interests of their organisation once the process is in effect complete from their point of view.
Yeah. Good answer.
Okay, councillor. Questions?
Well,
Should we move to
just
the
a mo-
recommendation?
oh,
Councillor
yeah,
Wood,
just in
question?
relation to, so I take it the Ferguson terminal, the container terminal, it's got capacity for a long time, as many years out from now. Would that be correct?
It has capacity, but in the time frame of the study, will given base case projections become constrained. That capacity requires further capital investment in automated equipment in order to achieve the handling capacity that is likely to be required. One interesting thing to note about that investment is that any investment in such capital equipment could be picked up and relocated to an alternative port. So you would not have a stranded asset problem if you did that.
Yeah, so they're the different types. This report has actually looked at the different types of technology that can be used there, IT technology and machinery, to increase the capacity considerably from even where it is now. But that capacity increase could occur in the short term without that expenditure, couldn't it?
We didn't look at the some capacity could be increased without expenditure, but the more capacity increase you require, two things happen. One is you have to put more capital in, and the other one is as you get up to the sort of 2 to 3 million TEU numbers, you start to become uncertain as to whether the capacity and what capacity will be delivered in the end.
But that 2 to 3 could occur in their current, in the current configuration.
Perhaps. I think that's debated. I think there's a reasonable degree of confidence about the 2. There's a pretty low degree of confidence about the 3. And given what we know now, it's probably somewhere in between.
Okay. So they're about 900,000 TEUs at the moment.
Yeah, probably, around about that. A bit closer to a million, perhaps.
Okay, so that gives quite a bit of time. There's quite a bit of time that dwell between now and when that capacity of 2 to 3 million will be reached.
Well, that depends on the growth rate. The consultant's earliest indications would give us a reasonably limited amount of time when you consider how long it might take to make a decision and to go through the planning and consenting and consultation processes, and then design and construct a port.
Thank you. Member Ngāmane?
Kia ora koutou, kia ora Rick. Just a couple of questions. The first one is just noting the comments that you relayed early in the piece around Karen Wilson's position, and she was the Waiahua rep on the CWG working group. I'm just querying whether that ought to be noted in the body of recommendations, given that the title is Consensus Working Group, and consensus hasn't been reached. That communication was released.
Was received post the handover of our document.
So you're saying consensus was reached in your understanding?
In my understanding, consensus had been reached. I think that There was a meeting that Karen did not attend where consensus was reached, and there were communications directly with people who were not at that meeting to test the conclusions. And then Karen was at subsequent meetings, and after those subsequent meetings made the communication to me. So I was just awkward in terms of the timing. I would much prefer to have had the opportunity to put that in the document, but we didn't get there.
That's a query, probably for the body and recommendation, in terms of whether consensus has been reached given that comment. The second one, the second comment is a bit of comment in the CWG report about additional efforts going to be required to look at mana whenua values, cultural assessments and the alternative locations. Do you think that ought to be highlighted too? The need for that, because I am aware that as we've gone through the port study at each recommendations of council, there's been a signal for the need for an assessment, and I don't know your sense of it certainly wasn't able to be done in the body of this port just because of the timing, etc. But I wonder whether that statement ought to flow through to the recommendations to the new council too, that there's an expectation that there is a more comprehensive cultural assessment of alternative options. So that was just something else I wonder that's missing potentially from the recommendations.
I think in the recommendations of the consensus working group, I think that's highlighted.
Yes.
I think it's not my judgment really as to what
but
you
I'm
highlight
just
here.
noting it was highlighted in the SWG report.
Yeah, certainly think. I should say that I certainly think that it will be very important to do that going forward. One of the things that created some challenges for us was that I think it was pretty clear that none of the expansion options were attractive to those that we spoke with, and that meant that not only from a process point of view, but from a content point of view, there was considerable further work required. And having discovered that, there wasn't a lot of time or value for us in getting a very deep understanding of that because of the importance of picking it up at the next stage.
And just the third question, it's more of a general one. So there was like a multi-criteria kind of framework used to look at alternative options. Did, in doing that and coming to the two areas, I just want to get a sense of, for example, somebody could say a port at the end of Great Barrier, like, I know, shock horror, but when I actually look at values potentially on the undeveloped site that's been identified around the Firth of Thames, and I look at that objectively, some of those values could be similar as, say, an island of the Gulf versus the Firth of Thames. So how broad did it kind of look at that? That's all I'm saying. For example, if an area of an undeveloped nature with a lot of values, ecological, etc. values, can be identified as an option, then similarly, was that span or that lens looked closer to home? Closer into the inner harbour? I'm just wondering. I just want to get a sense of that there wasn't a not in my backyard element in this option selection.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer to that is nobody wants a port in their backyard except possibly Northport. So, let me just talk a little bit about the process, because the process was to scan the coastline and understand where it might be technically feasible to put a port. And then there was a process of multi-stage narrowing down to where more attractive options amongst those were. And it was clear that cultural and environmental disadvantages existed for most of the location options. And so then the question is, are we narrowing in the appropriate way? And we did some kind of sensitivity analysis around that. For example, we removed all the all the physical and financial and economic analysis and just looked at the cultural and environmental and social, and we still got the same kind of ranking out of it. And I guess the other thing that I was always alert to was keeping my ears open for people who were saying, oh, but you've left out the end of Great Barrier Island, for example. And there wasn't any of that. So it left us with a reasonable degree of comfort. Certainly the MCA is not an analysis is not a tool to do a cultural assessment. It's a tool to kind of filter options and remove the least attractive one so you can focus on the most attractive one. And I think in that respect it worked reasonably well.